Thank you to my wonderful panelists who are here. What we're trying to talk about today, as Andrew so wonderfully framed this morning, is grounding and operationalizing some discussion around agentic, which is a very hot topic du jour. So what is really happening on the ground? What are some things that people might have misperceptions around? And then what do we actually do, these people in the room today, what should we do about it moving forward? So I want to just start with some brief intros to the panelists. I want to pass it off to you to introduce yourselves a little bit more. And if you could ask yourselves, what do you think is the state of agentic AI right now, right? How do you see it briefly? I guess fact, fiction, or fluff could be a good one word, but feel free to expand on that a little bit. I can start. So I work at Mastercard's AI governance team. We see all of the AI products that Mastercard builds internally or buys externally, including a lot of agentic stuff. So to me, agentic AI is very much a fact, and I think the real challenge here is how do we do good governance and how do we do good management of controls to manage some of the risks around those systems. So I'll pass off to David.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm David Ryan Polgar. I'm the founder and president of the nonprofit All Tech is Human. We try to bring people together across civil society, government, industry, academia to tackle these thorny tech and society issues. Alayna, thank you for kind of setting this up. Thank you all for being here. When I think about agentic, I think of it obviously as fact, but currently kind of in a hype cycle, thinking back coming here of movable, sidewalks. Been around for well over 100 years. We still have them. If you're in JFK or any airport, you still have them. But when they showcased, I think it was in 1900 in Paris, that was seen as like the wave of the future. Right? But I still came here on a ferry and walked on the sidewalk. But if you read like an Isaac Asimov, sci-fi, when we're thinking about 2026, we should all be on movable sidewalks, right? So I always think about it in terms of, yes, it has a use case, but it's probably not going to be what it's always being imagined at currently.
Yeah. Joanna.
So I'm Joanna O'Connell. I'm Chief Intelligence Officer for Omnicom Media. I get to do basically professional learning as a job. So I do all the consumer research and thought leadership at the center for Omnicom Media, and which is very cool because I got stats and stuff because I'm a nerd that I want to talk about. But I think if you think about the consumer, and I think that's probably the lens that we want to take as part of this conversation, just as we are also going to talk about the business and how the business works, I don't think the consumer thinks about agentic at all. I think it's extremely immature in terms of like true mass consumer-facing use cases for agentic, when agentic is the thing that goes from generating a response or a video to the thing that's taking an action autonomously, right? Mm-hmm. That is the sort of crossing point that I think consumers aren't really experiencing yet. What they're experiencing in massive numbers and adopting in massive numbers is generative AI. They are using these tools as influencers now in their purchase decisions and their learning cycles. And the people that are using these things, which is like most Americans now, many of them are using these things daily. So I think it's important, when we're thinking about the consumer in the advertising ecosystem, to understand how they are perceiving and using these tools, and pull that apart a little bit from how the business is using these tools and industry.
Absolutely, yeah. And Owen.
I'm Owen Davis. I'm a investor at a fund called Contour Ventures here in New York, and I've been doing that a long time. Agentic is real. It's being adopted, I think, roughly, a third of the Fortune 500 have some type of agentic sort of pilot. I think that's the number that people are throwing around. And there's two sort of aspects of it. So the first aspect of it is sort of the functional aspect. What can it do? How geometrically better is it than sort of what's come before? And it is geometrically better. And given that it is such an improvement over existing, sort of software paradigms, it really it's a real leap forward. So, one has to assume that it's inevitable and it's got a level of intelligence that really didn't exist before, a level of autonomy, a level of decision-making that everybody sort of wants. The other aspect, though, which is, very relevant to this room, of course, is what are all the controls? What are all of the problems that go along with this very nascent sort of technology infrastructure? And there are many, right? The data leakage, the data privacy, the sort of many other things around, cybersecurity and privacy and, a number of other things that I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, thank you all. And I think very grateful to have a fantastic trifecta of folks here who are on, the business and investing side, consumer facing, and thought leadership here. So what I want to do is dive into a grounding, a definition. What is agentic? What is the current state? We take a snapshot right now at this moment. I want to share actually a definition. There was a fantastic University of Edinburgh paper, which is my alma mater, shout out, on governance agents in financial services that defines the technical stack of agents as a 5-part structure. So 1, it's an LLM. This is crucial. All agents really have some type of generative AI, right? So when we talk about generative AI, agents are just a subsection of that. So 1, an LLM. The second is some type of prompt or system level instruction. The third is a tool layer. This is crucial to agents. It is accessing something else, a calendar, a scheduler, a something that it can use and to make an action. Fourth is memory, right? So it's not just using all memory from ChatGPT. It has a specific set of memory. Then 5 is guardrails or some specific level of instructions around what it's supposed to be doing. So all of these things in a bundle surrounded by some type of orchestration layer makes an agent, right? So it's a set of component parts, and we already know a little bit about most of those component parts, but all together it makes something quite different. So what I want to do is I want to first go to Joanna, because you have such a good sense of how consumers and real people on the ground are using this. So I want to ask you about how people are interacting with agentic, and again, how you see that difference between generative AI and agentic AI from just, B2C, right? And we'll get to Owen on B2B, which I think is a lot of agentic stuff in a minute, but we wanted to start with you on the actual people in the world.
So I would say stay tuned, because our second half big thought leadership piece will be around marketing in an agentic era, and we haven't done it yet because we're not there yet, really. What you do have is marketing in a generative AI era, right, where things like generative engine optimization are massively important. We've done tons of research on that stuff, how consumers are using these things. Again, GenAI is a sort of new disintermediating layer between brands and consumers, and information and consumers, and a new influencer, and sort of all the things that organizations can do to kind of be prepared for a world that looks like that. But this notion of the thing autonomously takes action for me is still really not, I would say, something that is mass adopted by consumers, because it's just not really there yet. Now that doesn't mean there aren't lots of consumers with agentic use cases. I think you can certainly think about anybody who codes in their personal life or their professional life. Like, there are lots of examples of individuals using individual things, but I think they are kind of on the edge rather than representing the kind of mass consumer. And I do have one stat we asked a couple months ago around, like, would you be comfortable of the AI buying some, making the decision for you or making the purchase? And 62% were like, no, I am not comfortable with that thing just going off and buying something for me. So there's still I think a real material fear, and I think for a lot of the reasons that you're talking about, data security and safety, they worry a little bit about the ethics of this stuff. They worry about how their data is going to be used. And then there's just this sort of agency, as a concept, like the consumer having agency over decisions. And we're just not at a place yet where most consumers are comfortable with the notion of the agency living somewhere else.
Yeah, so I think that's that key component of it's making the decision for you, right? Not like you can imagine an agent with the stack that I used in the definition of it's actually accessing tools, it's doing all this stuff, but it's not making the decision for you. It's not clicking buy. It's not scheduling the thing. It's maybe setting it all up for you. Do you think consumers are more in line with something like that, or is that still nascent?
I think because they're not experiencing yet what it looks like. So I think when technology gets to a place where it's relatively easy and seamless and adds value, people adopt things en masse.
Yeah.
Smartphones,
yeah.
internet, whatever. But GPT, LLMs to help you, pick your outfit for a wedding, which I just had to do. And then I went off and bought the things it recommended. I truly did. But when it becomes something that is available to people with a level of, I don't want to even say transparency, because that maybe is giving industry too much credit, which is why we're all here to talk about this, but with the level of like seamlessness, and it feels simple and safe, I guarantee people will, of course they will use it.
Yeah.
Of course course they will.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen lots of adoption in generative AI systems, so it sounds like
Tons.
on the B2C front, and I totally agree with you, I think this is B2C front, agents not quite as impactful, but I want to go to Owen now because I want to see what you're seeing in your work as a venture capitalist with Contour, and I'm sure we probably have similar experiences at Mastercard. What are you seeing in the B2B startup space on agents? What are you looking at, and what seems like it's successful, or where are things going?
Yeah,
right? What's happening now?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I see most of the activity for Agentic right now is internal operations that you would never see as a consumer, right? So one of the early big applications that got adoption is sort of answering phones, right? I mean, LLMs are good at text and speech and things like that have to do with words. And so the answering the phones, the automated, the next generation of sort of phone systems, and that leads into customer success. How do we sort of like make sure that we can handle at scale, complaints and trouble tickets and all of these other things that actually have to do with that area. So, and then internal processes such as, in basics, boring stuff, invoicing, that you can now read an invoice and see what it looks like and then actually get it into a database in a much better way where somebody doesn't have to literally sit there and code every field. So it makes that much easier. But, that level of sort of internal operations, somebody calls, they need a part number, they need a blah, blah, blah. That stuff is being implemented today. But, and I'll mention this and I'll sort of, put it on the table. The problem is, of course, the hallucination aspect of agents. And we aren't at the point where whatever back-end intelligence brain you're using, whatever LLM you're using, we're not at the point where there's 100% accuracy. And it really does cause a lack of adoption because of it. And until the hallucination problem is solved in a much better way, and there are a lot of people working on it, and it will be solved probably, it's much better than it was a year ago. In a year's time, it will be much, much better. But until that really happens, I think there's a lot of, you can't have mistakes, obviously, in some of this stuff. And so the adoption, it's slow, it's experimental. It's like, we're going to do it over here in this department. The uptime is terrible right now. If you're really running an agentic infrastructure, the downtime is totally and completely unacceptable to sort of the average IT person. And so you've really, there's a lot of stuff to improve from just a base layer of making this industrial sort of like, ready. And we're not there yet. But people are really using it because of the incredible increase in functionality.
Yeah, and I want to get to some of the risks in the next section, but I want to actually ask David. David, you sit on top of this wonderful organization, All Tech is Human. I think you have a really good meta view of the thought leadership and civil society. What's coming out from, so we talked about consumer, B2B. Right. When you look at the broader thought leadership on Agentic, what are you seeing? What are people saying right now?
I'd say there's a huge gulf between what you're going to hear in this room versus what you hear in just like Kenosha, Wisconsin, if you're sitting at a diner. For example, I'm looking around, I see nobody wearing Google Glass or any type of wearable device. Yet if I was at an event 10 years ago, everybody would have been hyping that up. There's a famous TED Talk by a co-founder of Google where he pulls out his smartphone and says, well, this is so inefficient. We're not looking at each other in the eye. Therefore, we should get rid of the smartphone. They've been trying to kill a smartphone for 10 years, but everybody here has a smartphone in their pocket. So I think there's a huge gulf. If I listened to everything I heard at all the conferences I've been to over the last decade, I would have come here on my Segway that I bought with Bitcoin, wearing my Google Glass, but instead I came in on a ferry and I'm going home on a subway. Welcome to the future, right? Yeah. So there's a huge difference. I think when you talked about the general public, as you mentioned, control, that is the part that always gets overlooked. That's the human element. For example, jump in a car. How come my car allows me to go twice the speed limit, but it doesn't send a ticket to the law enforcement? All of that could be done, but we lack control. I remember when I was growing up, they created something between the two toll booths, and they said, hey, if these were 60 miles per, apart, and you went faster than an hour, therefore you went faster than the speed limit, we could send you an automatic ticket. People revolted, even though that is logical, even though that makes sense. On one hand, Owen, you can talk about perfecting the system, but that's getting ahead of getting ahead of it, because you need to first see, well, is this something that the general public wants to actually adopt? When I look at agentic, I think it really comes down to assistance, right? If it's low stakes, people like to kind of send that off, but never forget control. And I will also say agentic has had multiple versions of this. I used to do a show called Funny as Tech, where we talked about tech ethics inside of a comedy theater. John C. Havens was one of our first guests, so hopefully I had a good time on that. But I remember another guest, Dennis Morrison. He ran a company called X.AI, which is big here in New York, right? You should have saved that very valuable domain now that got bought up. But the point is, that allowed you to have either Amy Ingram or Adam Ingram, who would be your AI assistant, right? That was before we were using agentic. I think right now what's tricky is you have true agentic, and then you have the fact that is so hyped that so much investment goes in it, therefore its term usage gets expanded into kind of like its nth degree. But just generally speaking, to kind of bring it back home, yeah, I'm overextended, I'm overworked, I'm stressed. If I could give away some of the low stakes, I would. But I think when you're talking about financial control, when you're talking about taking it away, for example, right now I have 3 flights that I need to book. It's so annoying, right? I hate it. I would love to give that up. I would love to have that time back. That's what technology is for. More efficiency, right? More pleasure, more time to read poetry, right? But that's not happening. I would love to give that away, but at the same time, would never want that to buy the tickets for me. But if I went back to my office and it said, David, like, here's this great flight. Seems like the price went down. What do you think? Okay, it seems to go through your schedule. Sounds good. That acts as an assistant using agentic, but doesn't take it to, over the finish line without my control.
Yeah, I think there's a big, and I think Joanna, I'll go to you in a second, but I think there is a big trust gap, as Andrew was saying, right? How do you get something to trust? And to Owen's point, I think in a lot of business systems, you can get, this is 90% accurate. That's kind of useless. That's too low.
Yes.
It needs to be 99% accurate. And a lot of LLMs just have this unacceptable rate of accuracy. And I think that is a technical problem to solve. So it sounds like there's a gap between current trust, and what we would need to get to, and a gap between consumer and B2B. But yeah, Joanna, I think you wanted to respond.
Well, there's a bunch, but there's something nice about the word agency that I also like. Like it's a sort of sister to control.
Yeah.
Right. Like this concept that the human has ultimate agency over the decision. So I don't know. Just there's something important there. I was going to say too, like anecdotes aren't evidence. I say that all the time inside my organization. And I say that all the time on stage because people love to give anecdotes. We all do it. But what'll be really important will be the evidence, and that we don't have yet. We don't. I mean, maybe you do, and I'd love to see it.
Sure.
But that's the next research we want to do.
Totally.
In what circumstances would someone want to do this, or is there a tipping point where they're willing to do it versus they're not willing to do it? It's a little hard because it's a little theoretical right now for them because this stuff doesn't generally exist. For the average consumer in Kenosha. Is it Kenosha?
Yeah.
Kenosha. And so I'm fascinated by that, and I kind of can't wait to understand that better. But one of the things I wanted to say is that we work in advertising, and so we can also, just address the fact that there are tons of things happening with agentic workflows in the advertising business, like tons and tons and tons. And I think hopefully we'll talk about some of that stuff today. But what's interesting is when you ask consumers about how they feel about AI being used in advertising. So I wanted to maybe give you guys a couple stats.
Yes.
But can you promise not to share them because this hasn't been published yet? Is that possible?
I think this is live streamed, so maybe.
Okay,
maybe
keep it
not.
to yourself. Because I'm going to use this stuff at some point. But it was so apropos. Like I just got the data back. It was so apropos to this conversation. So, like more than 80% of people say they have thought about AI in advertising at some point. Now, this is consumer research. I think it was 1,000 people, census balanced in the U.S. And we fielded this like 3 weeks ago or something. And so I want to say also, it's likely we're leading the witness a little bit, right? Like we're asking them some pointed questions about AI and advertising. So if you didn't set them up, they might not be thinking about it. But 80+% of people think at least a quarter of the ads that they see are AI generated. What makes them think that? The vibe feels artificial. something's off, it's too perfect, it doesn't feel authentic. So there's like this level of like, I think it's happening and it's making me feel a little suspicious, but I'm not really sure when it's happening and if I can spot it. But also so interesting is that we asked people about the ad itself, and then we asked people about like AI being used to place the ad, the when, the where, the how frequently. And as a general rule, they're more comfortable with the notion of the placement, the when, the where, than they are about the ad itself. The fundamental thing, though, over here is that they don't like the idea that it's entirely AI generated. They really want humans pushing the machines and using the machines as augmentation and an enabler. And so I just say that out loud because it's so important to remember that there are people on the other side of this that are starting to experience these things, and we have such an opportunity to not F it up. We will, definitely, of course we will, but there's also so much good that can come with brands being thoughtful about how they approach consumers with this stuff that consumers touch.
Yeah, that's great. And I totally agree with you, Joanna, that there's, I think, a lack of real empirical, real world evidence. It's really hard to get. Someone can ask me later how I feel about benchmarks. That's aside of this conversation. But I think we've mentioned a lot in this panel about, where are things at currently, and identified a few gaps, right? A trust gap, an implementation gap in terms of the technical architecture. And I want to talk about, I think some of the areas where we could be doing a little bit more, right? So like, where is AI, agentic AI, not living up? Where do these gaps live? Where are some of the fears around this? For us, we think about governance. At Mastercard, we have a risk assessment, control, verification framework. So what are the risks of this system within its context and within its technical stack? And then what are the controls? We can do something about it. We can do a bias test. We can do, data normalization. We can do a number of things that fix the risks of this system. I think when we think about agentic, we're thinking about that. And I think I want to go to Owen with this because I know you had mentioned a few things about how do we get there? How do we have controls in place? What does that look like? How do we address these gaps?
Yeah, so there's sort of two ways to think about it. So one is you have this like fully, sort of independent system where, you called it sovereign AI. That's not really, in IT lingo, it's on premises, but regardless, it means that it's totally and completely sort of, isolated from the external world. And the problem with that is that it really poses all sorts of problems for implementation, right? So much of agentic infrastructure is dependent on most likely an LLM, a fundamental LLM. If you're making queries to Anthropic or OpenAI, you really can't have that. You're not going to import that entirely into your own infrastructure. So you've got that aspect of it, which some people are trying to do and control data and control privacy. And then you have the other aspect of it, which is really just policy internally, right? And that's what really you're talking about, which is what are the series of policies that you absolutely as an organization need to implement to make sure that the usage, the data access, all of these other things that happen, as part of implementing an agentic infrastructure are safe enough. And so, you really can't do the first. The first you can do to a certain degree, but you actually have to go to one of the fundamental LLMs and sign a very, very tight policy with them. The enterprise policies right now still have a couple of loopholes, which I think are really problematic. I think are going to be problematic ultimately for really, really sensitive data. If you are a bank and you have to make a query to an LLM about some transaction that's occurring, it's almost impossible to do, right? Where how could you can't allow that to exist. So that needs to be solved, and that is very much a economic problem where there's no reason that they need to keep that data in their history and use it to train the next generation of model and whatever. But clearly they want to do that, right? Obviously they want the models to be better. So that's an issue, right? That will have to be worked out. And then the internal sort of policy issues and controls and sort of all of the training that happens, data access and all of those other things you have to make sure that sort of those are established in place. If anybody wants to start a consulting company, that's it right there in terms of like going into Fortune 500s and coming up with these policies and data controls and whatnot. But nevertheless, those are the two sort of aspects that I see that need to sort of still be solved and solidified before this becomes really much more widespread. On the other hand, I do want to say, everybody's trying it. It's real because of the improvement of functionality, because of how important it really is and how effective it is as a technology, as an infrastructure, people are using it.
Yeah, I actually want to stay on you, Owen, for one more second, because you raise a really important point, I think, which is that a fundamental component of any agentic system is an LLM, large language model, and those are provided by a limited number of companies that have large enterprise contracts, right? And I'm wondering if you can speak to the ways that those companies are advancing. Maybe I know there's a lot of news about Claude Mythos, the Glasswing project, how you see interactions with these large language model companies and these foundation models evolving, or any risks with things like, Project Glasswing.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, there's a whole series of free open source models that if you want to train something locally on a very sort of discrete set of data, you're able to do that with these open source models. So that's, that is underway now. And it's going to be really interesting to see if those open source models and open weight models are actually going to be sort of take over from the enterprise, because you can own them, right? You can train it on your own data, you can own them, you can bring it into your own system. The problem is they're not comprehensive. Right? And if you really do need a more comprehensive, where every single thing is an edge case, then you really have to sort of access these larger models. You bring up something which is very different, which was, the Mythos, that got released, which was the latest Anthropic model. And basically it broke all of the encryption of, all sorts of cybersecurity companies, which is just awful, right? And it detected, thousands of, or hundreds of bugs in, Windows and Mac OS and, phone systems. I mean, it was, and so the reality is that the bigger question is who is actually sort of setting real policy against the use of these things. Like, that's the conversation. This is a governmental need where you don't kill innovation, but obviously you can't have these things just like go out the door the next day when no ethicist has reviewed them, no cybersecurity person has reviewed them, this is actually the screaming need right now of the government in terms of getting involved. I'm not a government person, obviously. I want innovation, I want a level of freedom, but for something like this, it's so critical that a group of people, a very large group, a body of people need to start coming out with some rational policies around these things, or the destruction is really sort of terrible.
Yeah, I actually want to toss that over to David.
Sure.
For your sense, because I know you do a lot of standards work, a lot of policy work. How do you see the human element coming in on this agentic, right, addressing these gaps here?
Definitely. I think you need to kind of bring together three different parts of the puzzle, which is the broad understanding of the general public. I think that's the part that oftentimes gets left out. If you're impacted by technology, you deserve a seat at the proverbial table. We always struggle with understanding. So is there almost like a larger Pew Internet research kind of side of what do we actually feel about this? How do we bring in those stats? You need to pair that up, and this is what we try to do at All Tech is Human, pair that up with a kind of a larger system of network